Taking a look at all the headlines now. It's the ITV Lunchtime News.
Putin's war, his attack on Ukraine has begun. The biggest test for the West is now real. NATO says Russia has shattered peace in Europe. People woke to explosions in cities across the country as the Russian president issued a dire warning to anyone who tries to stop him.
Whoever tries to impede us, let alone create threats for our country and its people, must know that the Russian response will be immediate and lead to the consequences you have never seen in history.
What will President Putin do next? By lunchtime, there reports that a second wave of shelling was underway. The human cost already clear, 40 lives lost as Ukrainians try to flee the capital. Western leaders lined up to condemn the invasion.
Our mission is clear. Diplomatically, politically, economically, and eventually militarily. This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
We now have war in Europe on a scale and of a type we thought belonged to history.
Will more sanctions change anything? We'll be live in Kiev, in Washington, in Moscow, and in Westminster.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Nina Hossain.
Good afternoon. The unthinkable has happened. The warnings came true. While many in Europe were sleeping, Russia's president began his attack on Ukraine. Putin is at war with a European nation. NATO says Russia has shattered peace on the continent. The conflict, while new, is already deadly. Ukraine says 40 people have been killed so far. Overnight explosions were heard in the capital, Kiev, a city now wondering what next as many try to flee. And what a test for the West. The sanctions didn't stop Vladimir Putin. His warning now to countries that try to stop him: Russia's response will be immediate and lead to consequences that you have never faced in history. We'll have reaction from Ukraine, from Downing Street, from Moscow and Washington. First, with what we know so far today. Here's Geraint Vincent.
Russia's invasion has already struck deep into Ukrainian territory. Here, its helicopters fly low over the suburbs of the capital, Kiev, on their way to attack an airbase on the outskirts of the city. The assault started before dawn. Across the country, Ukrainians were woken by the sound of explosions which lit up the sky. There were missile attacks on key military targets and the country's strategic infrastructure. On television, its people saw their president's response to what he described as a full-scale war. Volodymyr Zelensky spoke of the practicalities of popular resistance, urging his people to give blood and saying that his government would issue weapons to anyone who wants them. As columns of Russian armour rolled across Ukraine's borders, the Russian president was hosting Pakistan's prime minister at the Kremlin. He had earlier warned Ukrainians not to resist and other countries not to interfere. Whoever would try and stop us, said Vladimir Putin, should know that Russia's response will lead them to such consequences as they have never faced. The UK has delivered equipment to Ukraine to help prepare for this assault and sent soldiers to train Ukraine's armed forces. This morning, the Prime Minister offered spoken support.
Ukraine is a country that for decades has enjoyed freedom and democracy and the right to choose its own destiny. We and the world cannot allow that freedom just to be snuffed out.
In Brussels, the NATO alliance activated its defence plan for member countries who are Russia's neighbours.
We are an alliance of 30 democracies standing as one. We will protect our people and our values. Democracy will always prevail over autocracy. Freedom will always prevail over oppression.
Back in Kiev, the sirens wail and the traffic queues to leave the city. In a town closer to the northern border this morning, some people gathered in a square to pray. Hope for peace is now gone, replaced by fear of what may come. Geraint Vincent, ITV News.
Let's take a look at where the explosions happened overnight. Ukraine said Russia first launched strikes on its border guard units. Military vehicles had crossed the border at Kharkiv in the north, Luhansk in the east, Russian-annexed Crimea in the south, as well as from Belarus in the north. Let's go live now to Kiev and join our Europe editor, James Mates. What is the latest, James?
Well, fighting in the northeast, the southeast and also around Kharkiv is being reported. It's very, very difficult to get reliable information. The fog of war here is almost total. But there does seem to have been very substantial Ukrainian resistance. Those pictures you saw at the beginning of Geraint's report there were about 40 kilometres to the northwest of Kiev here, an attempt to capture a major airbase there. US intelligence had always warned that one of the prongs of any Russian attack would be to come to Kiev and try and decapitate the regime, and that may just be the early signs of that. Other than that, in this city it has been relatively quiet. A lot of people have tried to get out. Huge traffic jams have been seen on all roads heading west into what is perceived to be safer parts of the country. Very, very slow and difficult for people to get out. But as I say, so far this city is relatively unscathed.
The Ukrainian president has repeatedly called for Western help. NATO has announced defence plans. What are the details, James?
Well, important to emphasise that everything they're announcing relates to the defence of NATO members, of which, of course, Ukraine is not one. There are no intentions by NATO to actually get involved militarily here unless something were to spill over into the borders of a NATO member. And Ukraine and Poland, of course, do border each other. But the plan is to put much greater forces into those what are becoming frontline NATO states. This is the greatest crisis on the European continent that NATO has faced since the early 60s, since the Berlin Wall went up and the Cuban Missile Crisis. An Article 4 discussion is being planned for today. Even Sweden and Finland, not NATO members, are going to be included in those discussions. That's how widespread the concern is right across Europe.
James Mates, thank you very much. A very worrying time, of course, for anyone living in Ukraine. Tatiana Shevchuk joins me now from Zhytomyr, which is 120 kilometres west of the capital. How did you know the invasion had started?
My friends and family called me when Putin made his announcement, saying that apparently the war just started. And then I've heard the explosions because near my city there is a military airport, military airbase, which was attacked at approximately 5 a.m. So we are approximately 20 kilometers from that military base, but we heard the explosions.
How are you coping?
Sorry?
How are you coping?
The support of friends and family, that's the main thing. We were prepared for this for a long period. We've been hearing the news for more than months. So we had all the plans. Everyone had their belongings packed in case of emergency. So this just, I would say that each person had their own plan, because for us civilians, the order is to shelter the place. For people who can be mobilized or could join the military forces, they knew that they should go to their conscription points. So emergency services knew what they are doing. So I would say that the mood is tense. We are scared, of course, but we are staying calm.
Yeah, you seem remarkably calm given what has happened overnight and what you are facing. What do you want to see now from Western leaders after this invasion into your country?
Aggression to be stopped immediately. Russia should face their consequences for what they have done. We need immediate sanctions and not the sanctions we've seen so far, because those sanctions showed Russia that they can do whatever they want, and that's why we are attacked from like three borders, three sides of my country are attacked. So whatever can be done, trade embargoes, cutting Russia out of financial system, whatever should be done just to stop the invasion, block their assets. Kick off Russian oligarchs, their families from London. They are all war criminals. They support the regime. They are part of what's going on here.
We shall wait to see how they respond and what happens next. Tetiana Shevchuk, please stay safe and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
In response to Russia's attack here, the Prime Minister called the invasion a catastrophe for our continent. He gave this address to the nation a little earlier.
Our worst fears have now come true, and all our warnings have proved tragically accurate. President Putin of Russia has unleashed war in our European continent. He's attacked a friendly country without any provocation and without any credible excuse.
Our political editor, Robert Peston, is at Downing Street. Robert, the Prime Minister faced criticism for not imposing more sanctions and sooner. What did you make of his statement today?
So look, let's be clear, even his own MPs have criticised him for what they see as weaker punishment of individuals close to Putin, not as much action to weaken the Russian state financially as what the European Union and America did. But you know, let's be clear, I think it's now a naive view to say that if he'd imposed in fact, if the West had imposed harsher sanctions over the last couple of days, that would have deterred Vladimir Putin. It's now quite clear that he had planned to go in, and I think almost nothing that we would have done in the last couple of days would have stopped it. Of course, what now matters is how the West punishes what he has carried out today. We will hear more from the Prime Minister on further sanctions at about 5 o'clock, but we should be under no illusion. Putin has expected sanctions, he's defending himself against sanctions, and if we want to punish him in that way, we've got to be prepared to do it for weeks, months, possibly even years.
Look, Robert, this has already had an immediate effect on world markets. Oil and gas prices have soared. How worried should people be about that here?
Well, it's very striking that the Prime Minister today said he wanted to hobble the Russian economy, that he wants to wean us off our dependence on their oil and gas. And so we should be under no illusion that this will impose a price on us. The oil price is above $105, soared there this morning, price we haven't seen since 2014. The price of petrol will go even higher from the record prices we've seen in the last few days. And the price of gas has gone up 30% this morning, which means even after the 50% rise we've seen in gas bills over the last few months, we could see perhaps a similar rise over the next 6 months. So yes, we are seeing a terrible squeeze on our living standards, and if we are going to do anything to impose pressure on the Russian economy, there's going to have to be a huge economic, financial, living standards sacrifice right here at home.
Robert, thank you. A short time ago, I spoke to the former Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt and asked him for his reaction to what happened overnight.
Well, this is a truly grim day for democracies all over the world, because this is the first time for very many years that a major power has decided basically just to grab another country, the kind of thing that happened in the 19th century and some of the darkest days of the 20th century. And that's why our response needs to be partly tactical. How can we help the Ukrainians today to make this invasion as difficult as possible for the Russians? But it also needs to be strategic, because it's not just Russia. We have China that is also committed to upending the international order that has protected democracies. So it's a very, very serious moment.
And what does our response need to be? We heard from the Prime Minister earlier, more sanctions coming. Will any economic sanction have any impact on stopping Putin right now?
Well, we need to do them. We need to do a lot more. We need to stop buying Russian gas, stop allowing Russian billionaires using Putin's money to use London as a financial market. But we've also got to be very realistic. The purpose of sanctions is to restrict the ability of the Russian state to finance its own military. And they've got $600 billion of reserves. So this is a very long-term game.
What do you think President Putin's ambition is?
Well, I think he's been very clear. He wants to restore the USSR to a version of its former glory. He's often said that the dismantling of the USSR was the biggest historical mistake. And for his many faults, I suppose you could say one of his virtues is that he's very open about what he wants. He told us...
in terms of being open about what he wants, he said, didn't he, that any threat made to try to stop him will lead to immediate consequences, the likes we've never seen. People will be extremely concerned to hear that. What did you make of it?
I think we're all very concerned to hear that. It is a bully issuing a threat. But what we have to do in response is what the Prime Minister said, which is to make sure that the price he pays for this appalling act is just too high for Russia to bear. And we may not be able to achieve that in the next week or two, but if we make a sustained effort to do so with our allies, we can definitely do so over the coming years.
Jeremy Hunt, a very busy time. Thank you very much for joining us this lunchtime. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our correspondent Neil Connery is in Moscow. What's the reaction been there, Neil?
One of the things to bear in mind is that for most Russians, state television is their main source of getting news. And the coverage this morning has really focused on just what is happening in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, in those self-declared republics. What Russians aren't seeing on their televisions today is the enormity of what is taking place across Ukraine, especially in Kiev and elsewhere. They're not seeing that here. Now, Russians, I think, are left scratching their heads by what is going on here. They are shocked. There's some I've been speaking to today about what this all means for them, for their futures, the impact of sanctions. You meet other people here who are clearly backing President Putin and believe that he is doing the right thing, taking this action. But it is the question of the impact of sanctions. I mean, public opinion here is interesting. There was an opinion poll a few days ago that put it at 50-50 in terms of support for military action in Ukraine. But it is the elite, those around Putin, who sanctions really will be targeted at. That is the unknown in all of this, whether that will make much of a difference.
Neil, thank you. To the US now, where America is waking up to the news the world may have changed. We can join our US correspondent, Emma Murphy. Emma, when will we hear more from President Biden?
Well, we expect to hear from him in the next couple of hours. We understand that he's just held a meeting with his National Security Council here at the White House. He will soon be hosting a virtual meeting of G7 leaders. That was pre-planned, but of course the agenda will now have gone out of the window. The only topic, how to try and counter this amount of aggression coming from the Kremlin. There will then be a national address by the president, but to be honest, that will not just be a statement being made to the American people. It will be a statement being made direct to Moscow. He will have to find some very strong words if he wants them to resonate all the way to the Kremlin, because he has said all the way along that this would happen. He has almost tried to dare President Putin not to go ahead by saying he knew what his game plan was. That has not worked, but their intelligence on this occasion has proved to be correct. Now he has to decide with other world leaders what he can do to try and counter this adventurism coming from Russia.
Thank you, Emma, and you can join us after the news for a special extended Ukraine Q&A with our correspondents like Emma in Ukraine, Moscow, Washington and here in London. That will be live on the ITV News website. Let's join now our International Affairs editor, Raghi Omar, in your assessment. What does Putin want?
He wants to swallow Ukraine and in doing so remake the security architecture of Europe in which NATO is not paramount but Russia is. That's the big picture. In the immediate, on the ground, with 150,000 troops there, the aim is to spread panic amongst the civilian population, to take over key assets and bases from which to launch attacks, but in the meanwhile to degrade Ukraine's ability to govern itself to such an extent to make sure the banks don't work, the fuel depots don't work, that people flee the cities, that somehow either Ukraine surrenders or that there is such chaos that he is able to impose what is effectively a puppet regime to govern. He does not want to go to the full extent of a all-out invasion, but he may find himself doing that.
So what do you think happens next?
I think that Ukraine, all indicators are that they will resist. To what extent, we don't know. But Ukraine voted for democracy and independence in 2014. There's nothing to suggest they won't want that now. That will then change the entire strategic picture for Vladimir Putin, because then he has to take over a huge country, the biggest in Europe, where people will fight. Now, look at our experience in Iraq. At the height of our presence in Iraq with US-led soldiers, there were 600,000 troops before we could say we even pacified Iraq. That is the nightmare scenario. It'll be a short-term victory. I don't see how Ukraine is able to resist a full-on onslaught, but in the long term, it's devastating for Russia.
Raghi Omar, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, that is where we leave this lunchtime on a dangerous day for Europe, no doubt. Until just a few hours ago, the people of Ukraine were living in a peaceful European country. They are now the targets of unprovoked military action, with dire warnings from Western leaders about how devastating the consequences could be to their lives. The coverage, of course, doesn't stop there. Obviously, you can follow what is happening in Ukraine and reaction to it from around the world on our website as the day goes on. Mary will be here with the very latest at 6:30, and there will be a special Tonight programme here on ITV at 7:30, analysing today's momentous events and the wider impact on the rest of us. From me and everyone on the Lunchtime team, bye-bye.